When a religion is good, I conceive that it will support itself. And when it cannot support itself, and God does not care to take care to support it, so that its professors are obliged to call for help of a civil power, it is a sign, I apprehend, of it being bad. Benjamin Franklin, in a letter to Dr. Richard Price, 9 October, 1780.
Franklin, when writing these words, added that the reason religions required support for their message from the civil authorities was not due necessarily to protect the beliefs of the religion, but to provide livings or money to various members of the clergy that were affiliated with that religion.
Welcome to the United States of Amnesia. We are the podcast that reminds us of what we have forgotten. It is often said that history repeats itself. Mark Twain allegedly said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But over time, many topics have become clouded by biases and oversimplifications, or have become mythologized and now are misunderstood. Misunderstanding means learning the wrong lessons from history, perhaps, or even learning nothing at all. And that can leave us poorly prepared for history's next rhyme.
In the last episode, we covered the origins of the colonies in great detail. In this episode, we're going to cover the Founding Fathers and what they believed in, what their religious affiliations were, what their belief system was at the time of the founding. In order to set the table for that discussion, we need to at least discuss the Age of Enlightenment, which was going on in the background at the time. The Age of Enlightenment, in very broad brush summary, was a European movement.
Primarily French and British, and especially Scottish.
There you go.
Because there's a lot of Scottish Enlightenment thinkers coming over to Virginia to sort of promote their belief systems at the University of William and Mary.
I think you meant the College of William and Mary.
It was, yes, a European intellectual movement of the late 17th up to the late 18th centuries that emphasized reason, individualism, and skepticism of tradition. Challenging religious and political authority, it was influenced by the scientific revolution, which was going on. Thinkers of the day promoted ideas like natural rights, liberty, constitutional government, and importantly, the separation of church and state, which inspired revolutions, including both the American and French revolutions, and laid the groundwork for modern democratic societies. Key leaders of the Age of Enlightenment include, importantly, John Locke and the Baron de Montesquieu, as well as Rousseau, Voltaire, Kant, Goethe, David Hume, Adam Smith, and even Benjamin Franklin. We can also probably include Thomas Paine. We'll get to Thomas Paine in a moment. In the context of the Age of Enlightenment, in the background, something else was going on as well, and this was the First Great Awakening. It occurred in approximately the 1730s into the 1740s, and a little bit beyond that. It was a massive Protestant religious revival that swept American colonies, emphasizing personal faith, emotional experience, and new birth conversion over rigid doctrines. Led by figures like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, and I'll throw in John Wesley and Charles Wesley, the brothers at Oxford originally, who kind of kicked it off. It democratized religion, split churches, spurred the growth of denominations like Baptist and Methodist, and helped foster a shared American identity.
Benjamin Franklin and George Whitefield were actually good friends, even though they represent opposite ideas of the spectrum. In fact, Franklin was Whitefield's publisher in the United States.
And I would argue that the Great Awakening was somewhat of a counterbalance to the Age of Enlightenment, which was going on at the same time, as I mentioned, in different circles, but contemporaneous forces that helped shape the United States as it was conceived at its founding. I also want to say one other thing that occurred to me in my research, and that is that at this time, it was not really socially acceptable for anyone to really come out publicly and call themselves an atheist. That was really that was frowned upon.
Yes.
So everyone kind of had to conform to societal norms, people did need to kind of
have an official religion.
Have something, yes.
Yeah. I mean, and that makes sense. That makes absolute sense in that, that people felt the need to identify in some sort of spiritual movement of one sort or the other during the period. I mean, it was almost. It's social, but it's also a matter of conscience, and it kind of shows that you're thinking about this stuff. You're not just outright dismissing it, which is what an atheist was kind of an insult, which we see hurled against numerous founding fathers at one time or another, generally for political purposes.
We still see that hurled at people today.
Yes, we do.
We're going to go into the Founding Fathers now, and we're going to discuss each of them individually and what the beliefs were at the time. We're going to start with Benjamin Franklin.
Okay, Benjamin Franklin is probably familiar to many people just because of his various accomplishments, but he was born in 1706. He is the oldest of the Founding Fathers. He was born actually, even though he's associated with Philadelphia, he was actually born up in Boston and later migrates down to Philadelphia, where he becomes a huge success as a printer. But he was an American polymath, a writer, a statesman, a scientist. We all know the story about Benjamin Franklin's experiments with electricity. He was a diplomat, definitely a printer and publisher of a variety of works, including George Whitefield, as I mentioned before, and a political philosopher. He could be regarded as the patriarch of the American Revolution and also the establishment of the Constitution, because Franklin is actually present at both the meetings in Philadelphia that resulted in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He was considered to be America's leading citizen and a representative of the European Enlightenment. Both Locke and Montesquieu were two leading philosophers of the movement, as Blake mentioned, and the crux of their belief system was civil power was based on an inherent contract between the people and the government, and this is something that Franklin embraced here. Previously, the notion was, and until the French Revolution, this idea was commonplace, God chose the leadership of the government, the king, for want of a better term, and that was kind of what provided legitimacy. Franklin and all the other founding fathers would ascribe to this theory of government, which would also impact how religion was viewed in its relationship to the state. They ascribed to the whole notion, just to be clear here, of the social contract. In England in the 17th century, this had been marked by a contest between high church Anglicans who supported the king or the queen, and low church Anglicans and Puritans who sought a more authentic religious position. And this took the form of political discourse and political debate during the 17th century. There were also Catholics who were treated as kind of interlopers. Catholics in 17th century England and even beyond were regarded somewhat like the way extreme Republicans regard Muslims today, as somewhat traitorous, alien, and not really part of the social fabric, but there to be regulated as such. And they were regarded as wanting to impose an alien doctrine on Britain. They still existed and regarded with great hostility and were subject to all sorts of penalties. Franklin was a deist. Now, deist is an interesting term, and we're going to encounter this a lot during the course of our discussions. And let's just agree to understand this. There is no deist doctrine that people ascribe to. People self-identify as a deist, but they're not necessarily all part of a similar belief structure.
Did they even call themselves deists?
Publicly? Some of the founding fathers are going to call themselves deists.
Okay.
And we'll get to some of those. I mean, like Thomas Paine called himself a deist and said deism was superior to Christianity. He viewed it as a higher, closer relationship to God, even though he was referred to as an atheist as a result of this. But the thing to keep in mind here, there is no deist liturgy or doctrine. There's no guidebook to deism. No. You just you ascribe to a certain mindset about religion, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody took this on in the same way. Say, like Jefferson's going to say, I don't believe in miracles here, and people talk about the afterlife.
It was an outgrowth of the Age of Reason.
It's an outgrowth, and people would kind of come to certain conclusions on their own, but they would retain certain other vestiges of Orthodox Christianity of one sort or another in their belief structure.
I think we discussed in an earlier episode some of the features of deism. Because you're saying it's a mindset.
It's a mindset. It's an attitude.
It does have characteristic features if you're a deist. You do believe in a creator who set the universe in motion, but you don't believe that creator intervenes in human affairs. You don't believe in miracles. You don't believe in anything that would be considered maybe superstitious.
You might not even believe in the divinity.
You don't believe in the divinity of Christ. Now, that is pure, if I want to say it, like pure deism.
Right.
But like Marshall is alluding to, when you look at the Founding Fathers, they did not see a big contradiction between being deist principles of those kind, and being Christian.
Right.
And a lot of them some of them anyway, tended to merge those two to create what's been called Christian rationalism or Christian deism. And we'll get into that, I think, as we go along in this discussion. But it's not exclusive the way people nowadays might make it might make it seem in their minds.
There's no cookie-cutter deist.
There's no cookie-cutter deist. And there's no necessarily contradiction in their minds between deism and at least some Christian belief. And that's important to keep in mind. It's not the way people would think about it now, I'm sure. But
there's Christian morality, which they would certainly I would say all of the Founding Fathers would embrace the morality that's expressed by Jesus there. But you have some who believe in the power of prayer, which implies that you have a God who will intervene in human affairs. And we see this in some cases with people who are self-identifying as deists or even Unitarians. So one should keep in mind, when we say deist, we kind of need to define things further when we're speaking of the various Founding Fathers here. Just as there is, as we discovered last time, there is no Christian religion. There's Christianity, but there's no single doctrine that unites all Christians and with few exclusions. There's all sorts of disputes over things like infant baptism and transubstantiation and things like that help define differences between various Christian faiths here. And it's the same with deism. Let's talk about Franklin here. Franklin was part of the Puritan context. He grew up with a Puritan heritage. He was brought up as a Puritan. And Franklin, even though Franklin's kind of a free thinker, he was able to sustain a relationship with his very religious sister, who was a Congregationalist, Jane Macomb of Boston, and also, as I mentioned previously, George Whitefield, one of the preachers of the Great Awakening. Whitefield is a more doctrinaire Christian, and he was opposed to an established church, which lines up with the whole kind of personal relationship with God, kind of making church not a bureaucratic or government experience, which it kind of had become over in Britain at this point throughout the 17th century. I mean, it was a matter of patriotic loyalty almost to the Queen or the King, whoever was in charge of things there.
And probably the same was true of the Anglican Church in the colonies at the time.
Yes. I mean, that's kind of what he is. He represents a kind of breakdown of the sort of like automatic alliance. If you're British, you have to be, or if you're English, you have to be Anglican. If you're Scottish, you have to be Presbyterian, what he's looking for is he's arguing for a rebirth, spiritual rebirth.
This is Whitefield.
This is Whitefield. And again, this is leading to the erosion of a state-sponsored religion, because if it's all about you, it's not about the institution.
It's a personal relationship.
It's a personal relationship.
You don't need the structure.
You don't need the structure. And so this is kind of why he appealed to Franklin. And Franklin also saw a lot of profit to be made here. Always remember Franklin's looking at ways to make money here. And this is why he was able to retire at like 35 or 40 very early on in life. Franklin's position, which was different from, say, the 17th century controversies, was that in no system of thought it was wholly right or wrong. So this is totally at odds with, say, like the prevailing sentiments in Britain and in the colonies in certain places. We think about Massachusetts, which is constantly exiling people like Roger Williams because their belief system is the wrong belief system for theirs. Franklin is taking a more tolerant approach, or an approach that basically minimized religious differences, and they didn't, and it didn't matter regarding marriages or other institutions, as they were more or less the same as far as he was concerned. We're talking about
among the different denominations.
Among the different denominations, I mean, he's trying to minimize the differences between them because he sees a lot of common ground there. Franklin is always looking throughout his life for common ground. This is what made him a success as a diplomat. Morality is the primary element, and we'll see this in other founding fathers, in Franklin's interpretation of religion. Like other deists, Franklin believed that humans serve God best when they perform good works on behalf of humanity and society. And we're going to see that as a kind of common theme here.
I was going to say the same. We're going to see that over and over again.
Yes, I mean, when you think about kind of the sort of Calvinist position that that tended to minimize things like good works, this is kind of a bit of a revelation or revolution in how one approaches spiritual matters there. This idea is at odds with most organized sects of Christianity in the colonies, as it completely ignores the importance of faith in terms of salvation and matters pleasing to God. Franklin's views on religion, if understood today, would probably prevent him from playing any active role in public life in most of the United States. And I would add that Franklin also tended to be a little cagey about expressing his religious beliefs. There are lots of letters, but they're letters. Franklin is more than capable about publishing. If he wanted to put out a tract on this is what I believe religiously, he could do it. He was a publisher. It wasn't like he had difficulty with this, but he tended to confine, based on my research, a lot of these statements that we look at today to letters to trusted friends.
Now we're going to cover George Washington.
George Washington, the father of our country. He's an enigmatic figure when it comes to his religious views or philosophies because he rarely discussed them, and he left very little in writing about what he thought about religion in the public sphere or in his own private life. So most of what we know about his religious views are inferred based on observations of his habits and his practices other than anything that he said or wrote. And there's a debate over this among historians and religious scholars that's gone on for, ever since George Washington was alive.
Yes.
So let's see what we can figure out about George Washington. So Virginia's official religion, as we discussed in earlier episodes, was the Church of England, which you can also call Anglicanism. Anglicanism just means of England. That church became known after independence as the Episcopal Church, Episcopal Church of the United States, which just means governed by bishops, and it gets rid of any reference to England or Anglican, meaning of England, because the church is governed by bishops.
Not by the Queen.
Not by the Queen, and not by the Pope either. The Pope is recognized as the Bishop of Rome, but he's not. There is no such thing as a Pope in the Episcopal or Anglican Church. Anyway, so Washington was from Virginia, so he was baptized as an infant in the Anglican, later Episcopal Church, and he attended Anglican or Episcopalian services all his life. He held office in the church. He was a vestryman, and a warden in his congregation. These are non-clerical appointments, which involve practical governance of the congregation. They're expected to set a good example for others, maintain order, things like that. They're not clergy, but they are obviously involved in the church.
More like administrative.
Administrative, sergeant-at-arms,
yeah,
those types of things. In colonial-era Virginia, and in fact until 1786, 10 years after independence, when the Commonwealth of Virginia, the state, finally eliminated it, the Church of England, Anglicanism, Episcopal Church being the official church, imposed office-holding qualifications at all levels if you're going to hold public office, including the House of Burgesses, to which Washington was elected in 1758.
And this is consistent with what was going on in England at the time.
Yes. When we talked about Virginia, the colony, in a previous episode, we talked about how what they had basically done in Virginia is just imported their religious practices of England with them.
Yeah.
They were English people living in North America now in Virginia. They did the same thing in Virginia that they did back in England.
Same rules and everything.
Yeah, same rules and everything. So to hold office, public office, required affiliation with the current state religion, Anglicanism, and an undertaking that one would neither express dissent for church doctrine nor do anything that did not conform to church doctrine. So he did that in order to hold office. It wasn't until 1786, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom disestablished the then Episcopal Church as a state church. So Washington therefore had a legal requirement for some kind of church association and church involvement with specifically the Anglican, later Episcopalian Church.
As did all of the Virginians that we're going to be talking about, too.
Yes. So his attendance, his involvement in the church, may have been a practical matter rather than one of conviction. Who can tell, right? All we know is that he swore he would, uphold church doctrine, and then he participated in church activities.
But he
that's
didn't
all we know.
take communion.
Well, we're going to come to that.
Okay.
Yes. So, let's get into his activities. What did he do then? What can we discern about his beliefs? So at Mount Vernon, he spent most Sundays writing letters, conducting business, fox hunting, doing other things related to running the plantation. Apparently, they've done some. He kept a diary, where and how my time is spent, I guess is what he called it, according to what I've seen. And in that, he tells how often he attended church, so whatever that tells you. So in the year 1760, he went to church 16 times out of 52 Sundays. In 1768, he went 14 times out of 52 Sundays. So he went about a third of the time.
Now it's going to be a trip for him.
Yeah, you're taking the words out of my mouth.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's going to be, even though this is like 20 minutes now.
Yeah, his first parish was Pohick Church. That was 7 miles away from Mount Vernon. His second parish was up in Alexandria, Virginia. That was 9 miles away.
Christchurch.
Yes.
And I read somewhere along the lines here that a ride to Pohick Church one way was 3 hours.
Yeah.
A ride up to Alexandria was 4 hours.
Yeah.
That is quite a ways. Yeah. That's a commitment.
Yeah, that is a commitment.
So it's a commitment.
That's why he didn't stay
so
for communion.
Well, you could probably...
No, I'm joking.
Well, inclement weather would probably put you off from having to take a 4-hour journey to Alexandria or to Pohick.
Right. And also just the time consumption. The idea of having a 2-day weekend came along later. I think Sunday was probably your only day of rest.
Yeah.
Right.
So you spend your whole day off. What do? You spend the entire day going to church, being at church, coming back from church, and your day's shot. Let's be practical about this.
Yeah.
So it was an investment of time to go to church for him. So he only went about a third of the time when he was at Mount Vernon. When traveling, particularly when he was traveling on political business, however, he was more likely to attend church services. So when he was at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, there were 7 Sundays during that conference, and he went to church on 3 occasions. And when he went, he attended Anglican, Quaker, and Catholic services.
Good for him.
Not just Anglican. So why? He didn't say. Trying to set an example? Probably.
Maybe interest? Or
perhaps also to set an example of inclusion?
Yeah.
We don't know. He didn't say. While he was president, he served 2 terms, 1789 to 1797. He made tours of the country. And when he did, he attended religious services in each city that he visited, sometimes as frequently as 3 services in a single day.
Well, it's certainly easier in some of these towns than from Mount Vernon to attend services.
It's easier. The other aspect of it, too, is, well, why did he do it on these political occasions?
Yeah.
Again, maybe he wanted people to think he was more religious than he was. That's possible. Maybe he wanted to set an example of inclusion. Again, we'll get into a little bit more of that as we go along, too. Of some of the possibilities there. As you said, Blake, he was not a communicant, meaning that he rarely, if ever, took communion. And in fact, he usually left religious services just before the taking of communion began.
Which was at the end of services.
At the end of services.
When it happened.
Yeah.
And it didn't happen every service like it does today in many.
Yes, but it usually does take place at the end, doesn't it?
Yes, it's usually at the end. Yeah.
But it should be noted that in the in the 18th century and the late 18th century when he was president, it was a common practice among churchgoers to leave before communion. It wasn't a very unusual thing to do that. He was among the ones who left. Martha, his wife, she stayed for communion, but George left. He apparently thought that taking communion would be hypocritical. During the Revolutionary War, especially then, he believed his mindset in fighting a war and being a military leader did not meet the requirements of a communicant. I guess because he's busy trying to kill people.
Yeah.
So, that would be why he felt it would be
I hadn't
hypocritical.
thought of that. That's interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting.
And then later in life, when he was a major public figure as president and other things that he did after the war, he thought it would be hypocritical then as well, because he thought it would be merely an ostentatious display of religiosity. He was a member of a congregation whose pastor criticized parishioners for leaving before communion at one point. The pastor worded it in terms of criticizing just everybody who left, but it was kind of clear that he was also saying quietly, "I'm looking at you, George," right? And Washington's response was to quit the congregation.
Yes.
Washington comes off in American mythology as kind of like a marble figure, like the statue of him in the Smithsonian or elsewhere. But it's like you can see Washington had definite principles that he was going to adhere to, and even though these don't necessarily, they are his own. They are something that he has figured out on his own, and they are very much something that he identifies with.
You can see from this that communion meant something to him. He understood the meaning of it, and he felt it would be hypocritical or for him to take communion given what he was doing in life. So he did understand communion, and he respected it in a way. He didn't take it because he respected it, not because he didn't approve of it or something like that, I think is the way I would interpret his behavior. I don't want to get into a lot about this. Maybe you guys want to say something about it, but he became a Freemason as a young man. I don't much understand anything about Freemasonry, but
I don't either.
It is.
I really don't.
It is associated with. Okay, I understand this. Okay. It is definitely something different than it is now. Now it is merely a fraternal organization, the Masons, And back then, it is kind of a gateway. It's still a fraternal organization, but it's a gateway to kind of free thinking. And this gets into the whole idea of works, the necessity of doing good works. And this is an important part of Masonic doctrine during this period. And this is kind of at odds with the whole notion and the importance of faith or some of the even more Puritan or Calvinist doctrine about people being predetermined for salvation here, then there's nothing they can do about it. Masons are supposed to be going off and doing good works throughout the community, and by this way, sort of like Franklin, who is also a Mason, it's about how they relate to God here. There's a divine part of this in terms of how that works. Interestingly, looking at Masonic doctrine, it is not just limited to Protestant countries as it is now. It's actually limited mainly to Protestant members. But it's like back in the period that we're talking about, there are Masonic lodges in Catholic countries such as France and Austria, and even Orthodox countries such as Russia.
Is it intrinsically Christian in any way, or is it?
It's kind of.
Does it have religious elements? But it's
there
not really Christian?
There are religious elements, but it's mainly focused on works.
Yeah, okay.
As I understand it.
Wasn't there an engineering focus?
That is a metaphor.
Okay.
I mean, like there is over in Alexandria, not too far from here, not too far from the church that Washington attended, there's the Masonic Memorial, which kind of dominates the Alexandria skyline. And if you go through it, which I have done, they do emphasize, the notion. My father was a Mason. My father would say that this is doctrine that goes back to Egypt, which, it was underground for a number of years, and there's plenty of other beliefs that we can document that that were not quite as dynamic as the Masonic doctrine, which kind of comes along in the 17th century all of a sudden. But it's like they claim that the symbols that are used in the Masonic belief system, there's a hearkening back to builders' tools. People that designed the pyramids were probably the first Masons. And so there is a sort of attempt to legitimize the movement by making it kind of this eternal historical notion about things. I would dispute
and the
that,
building of things, and the engineering of things.
And the structure, and this is kind of a metaphor for how you live your life. You structure it appropriately.
So it stands alongside religion.
Yes, I would say it does. And at some point, it becomes impossible to be a Mason and be Catholic.
Okay.
And this is why I am told there is a Knights of Columbus. That's the sort of Catholic version of the Masons. Because at this point, it evolves into a kind of more fraternal organization. But it is about works. That's the main thing.
So Washington was one of those. He became one as a young man and remained one apparently for the rest of his life. There are stories about his religiosity, most of which appear not to be true. There is a story that a Continental Army Baptist chaplain baptized him at Valley Forge, or maybe not, maybe in the Hudson River, or maybe in the Potomac River. So the story changes depending on who's telling you the story. And there's no documentation, not adequate one anyway, that the chaplain in question ever was even at Valley Forge. So it looks like he was not baptized by a Baptist minister anywhere, as far as anybody can tell.
All of these stories emerge after he died.
There is another story, limited to Catholic sources, that he underwent a deathbed conversion to Catholicism in 1799, but historians have deemed that one improbable. We do know that he was buried with Episcopal rites, and that his Masonic lodge also performed Masonic rites for him upon his passing. There's a story that he inserted the phrase, "So help me God," into the presidential oath of office. He did not. The first time that was used was when Chester Arthur was sworn in. He inserted the phrase, and that wasn't until 1881. So that's 82 years after Washington died. So what did George Washington think? Anglican clergymen of that era rarely invoked the name of Jesus Christ. I don't know what the reasoning is behind that or the history of that, but they rarely did. He did not either. There's very little evidence that he invoked Jesus for anything. There are apparently a couple of proclamations he issued, like when he was commander of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, or when he was president, a proclamation to the whole country, in which Jesus is mentioned. But scholars think that was an aide, who wrote it for him, and he just said fine and signed off on it. It wasn't him writing about Jesus. So he appears not to have invoked Jesus generally. He did, however, often invoke the role of providence, or the providence of Almighty God, or the blessings of heaven, as he would put it.
Deism terms.
These are deism terms. And he would invoke the role of providence, some people would say then divine providence, with reference to the Continental Army when he was commander-in-chief, or with, as president, reference to the United States as a whole. So he thought that God did intervene to help benefit the Continental Army, which won a victory over, one of the largest, best armies in the world. It actually won. That's kind of miraculous as far as he was concerned. And also just the founding of the United States, which in his view had so much going against it, but it wound up succeeding as a country, at least in his lifetime early on. So he did think that divine providence was involved in that. As president, he called upon Americans to thank Almighty God for wartime success, for peace, liberty, tranquility, rationality in the creation of the Constitution. He thanked God for that. And to ask God to forgive America its transgressions, and to allow the national government to be wise and just, to, quote, protect and guide all nations, to promote what he called true religion and virtue and the increase of science, and grant mankind the prosperity that he, meaning God, alone knew to be best. So he called on God for a lot of things, but you notice he called on him for help with science. He called on him for help with rationality. He thanked him for the rationality of the Constitution. That's an interesting way of putting a lot of those things. He often used the term great architect or great architect of the universe in Masonic correspondence.
And that's consistent with their belief system.
Scholars think that Washington's God was not a warm, loving, personal God, as described by, say, modern evangelical Protestants, but rather a more remote deity who controlled the universe and intervened in human affairs from time to time. So his beliefs, and we talked about this just a little while ago, his beliefs appear to have lain somewhere in between Christianity and deism. He has been described as a Christian deist and as a Christian rationalist by some scholars. And he perhaps combines the clockmaker model of the deity that deists use with the moral and ethical teachings of Jesus, but without believing in the divinity of Jesus or believing in religious revelation through Scripture. But he did believe in providence, divine providence. So he did believe in the God of the Bible's intervention in human affairs. So you have a kludge of Christianity and deism there. And apparently this mix of Christianity and deism was common among religious people in the late 18th century. They saw no reason to make a strong distinction between the two sets of beliefs. He believed that all religions and religious practices benefited humans. He was a proponent of religious toleration and of freedom of religion. At Mount Vernon, he expressed the view that people of all racial backgrounds, whether they were Christian, he specifically said, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or atheist, could be good workmen, and that all that mattered was that they were good workmen as far as he was concerned as an employer. Now, his slaves, one woman in particular who was an enslaved person at Mount Vernon, had a rather different view of him, said he just played cards and drank and he wasn't a very good guy at all, which is to be understood. If you're being held in bondage by somebody, you probably are going to have a pretty dim view of the man. And there's some truth to that too, probably, that he probably did drink and play cards at times. And if you were an enslaved person, sweating away watching that, you wouldn't have a very positive view of that.
He had a recipe for bourbon. It was a rye bourbon, I think, that's been revived.
Yeah. Are these practices, just because I think this might make an interesting distinction, were these things that the enslaved woman was reporting him doing on Sundays?
I don't remember.
Okay, all right.
Maybe, because that would kind of be his day off, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that would be his day off, and the fact that you're doing card playing and drinking on the Sabbath
would be offensive.
To some people.
We have to note, though, that he wrote a very famous letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island in 1790, in which he proclaimed that the United States, quote, gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. This was at a time in between the Constitution having been written and then the actual ratification of the Constitution with the Bill of Rights included, which was a big issue at the time. Some scholars say that his letter to the Hebrew congregation was one of the foundations of the First Amendment. Certainly, it was influenced by and influenced the First Amendment, the idea of no establishment of religion and freedom of religion. He appeared to think, and I think this is very important, he appeared to think that religious beliefs helped to maintain national tranquility in the new United States. He appeared to think that religion was a necessary underpinning of morality, and that religion impressed upon people the importance of political and social tranquility and obedience to the state.
And we find this with others as well. This seems to be not just a unique Washington position, but a commonly shared position amongst the Founding Fathers, that this is the role of religion.
The idea of morality, morality, and the idea that will lead to political and social tranquility. And Marshall, you talked in a previous episode about they were reacting to the English Civil War, the 30 Years' War, all the terrible religious wars that had gone on in the 17th century. Tranquility is big for the Founding Fathers. It comes up over and over again. They think religion is important to tranquility. But he said that regardless of one's faith, he asked only that one comport oneself as a good citizen who is obedient to the government. That was big to him. He may have thought that any focus on religious doctrine or denomination would disturb the national tranquility. So therefore, he preferred a more generalized belief in the value of religion as a whole to society without concern over doctrinal specifics. So basically, let's not argue over denominational issues. Who cares, right? The important thing is you have your beliefs. It teaches you a moral position. It keeps things tranquil. It teaches you to be obedient to the state. It teaches you to be good to other people. Let's leave it at that and not argue about the details.
And I would argue that this is again a reaction to kind of the controversies that are brewing in the 17th century England, which all the Founding Fathers are going to be familiar with, and some of them are actually some of the colonists are coming over to escape these things. But there is a definite pecking order, and this disturbs the tranquility It is a major factor in the disturbance of tranquility by trying to basically say there is only one faith, Anglican or Presbyterian, depending on what part of Britain you're in, and all the rest of you, low church folks for the Anglican Church, dissenters who believe things that are not Anglican, or Catholics, you're all just outside of the magic circle here.
He did advise young people that truth, character, and honesty were important, but he did not discuss specific religious practices with them.
Again, morality.
Now we're going to move on to Thomas Jefferson, the founder of UVA in 1819. Shout out to my alma mater. Thomas Jefferson held very complex views on religion that strongly influenced the development of the new nation. Jefferson believed in God, and he admired the moral teachings of Jesus, but he rejected many of the traditional Christian doctrines. He was skeptical of miracles. He was skeptical of the divinity of Jesus, the Trinity, and other supernatural elements of Christianity. Instead, he embraced ideas often associated with Enlightenment and deism, the belief that reason and observation, rather than religious authority, should guide understanding of God and the world. One of the clearest examples of his beliefs was his book, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, often called the Jefferson Bible, in which he removed miracles and supernatural events from the Gospels and kept in what he considered Jesus' ethical teachings. He actually cut out the miracle stories.
Yes.
So there are pages that are have
holes
this
in them.
cut out. Jefferson believed that religion was a matter of individual conscience and that government should not favor or establish any religion. He argued that citizens should be free to worship as they chose or not worship at all. His most important contributions in this area was the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which he authored in, 1786,
86,
I believe?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's on his, when you go to Monticello, there's the graveyard for the family, and Jefferson has like this big obelisk, and there are three things that he has on there. One of them is the Declaration of Independence. Another one is University of Virginia, so shout out to your alma mater.
Right.
And then the third one is this particular act that was passed.
Which was a big deal at the time. Big deal. So the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom ended government support for the Anglican Church in Virginia. It guaranteed freedom of religious belief and practice. It prohibited religious tests for civil rights and public participation. And as you said, Jefferson considered this one of his major achievements in life.
Not being president.
And yeah, exactly.
Not being ambassador to France, not being vice president or secretary of state.
Now, Jefferson is also famous for advocating a wall of separation between church and state. He used this phrase in an 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptist Association. By this, he meant that the government should neither interfere with religion nor promote a particular faith. He believed that government should protect religious liberty and that churches should operate independently of state control.
Or funding.
Or funding, correct. And that citizens should not be compelled to support religion through taxes or laws.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, the big thing with him that seems interesting, you know, like we do see that religion is supposed to be like a critical element for, say, like Jefferson, and we'll see it with others. But it's like, with Jefferson, you can have no religion. That seems to be like an important distinction worth calling out. You do not need to support any religion to be a fully fledged citizen, and you can lead a perfectly moral life without religion. And it's kind of like Jefferson kind of gets into trouble, say, in the election of 1800, where he is accused of atheistic practices. And this seems to be perhaps the distinction here, not that Jefferson doesn't believe in God, but that Jefferson permits the non-belief in God to exist without comment or coercion.
And he was a man of many books, and
Yeah.
he actually had a copy of the Quran.
Yes.
And he called Muslims Mohammedans.
Yes.
Which I get a kick out of.
Well, yeah, there were terms back then, and that makes sense for the time and period there.
Jefferson's ideas obviously helped shape American understandings of the United States Bill of Rights, especially the First Amendment protections for religious freedom. Although Americans have continued to debate the exact meaning of church-state separation, Jefferson's vision established a strong tradition of religious liberty and government neutrality toward religion.
Now we're going to talk about Samuel Adams, 1722 to 1803. In regard to religion, mutual toleration in the different professions thereof is what all good and candid minds have ever practiced, and both by precept and example indicated on mankind. Samuel Adams. Before he was the namesake of a well-known brand of beer originally made in Boston, Samuel Adams was an American statesman, political philosopher, and founding father. His reputation was more local than national. He was eventually mayor of Boston, and the highest elected post he ever held. Though a graduate of Harvard, which nowadays is seen to be kind of the golden ticket to success, he was not a successful businessman, and his focus became politics, mainly in opposition to the efforts of the British Parliament to tax the colonies without their consent throughout the 1760s and 1770s. These efforts reached a kind of crescendo with the Boston Tea Party, where colonists disguised as Indians hurled caskets of tea into Boston Harbor. This and other efforts were spearheaded by Adams and his Sons of Liberty at the Green Dragon Tavern, as befits a person associated with beer. A version of this tavern still exists on 11 Marshall Street in Boston, and I've been there. Though an advocate of toleration, Adams was no deist, so we're going to look at some people that aren't deists now. And he favored a legally and constitutionally required established religion, as we shall see. Adams was a religious Congregationalist as well as a follower of John Locke, so he didn't see any inconsistency with being a Congregationalist and supporting the belief system of someone who is a deist, is inspiring deist professions.
And the Congregationalists are the descendants of the Puritans.
They are the descendants of the Puritans, but they're also going to one liberal sect of the Congregationalists is going to evolve into Unitarians. Samuel Adams does not go in that direction. He remained a bedrock member of the Second Congregationalist Church in Boston his entire life. If you can say the two central institutions in his life, they are opposition to British taxation and the Second Congregationalist Church. So he is a vowed Congregationalist.
Now, weren't the Congregationalists the ones that believed in predestination? Some of them did.
Yes. Like with everything, I think, and this is something we're discovering, there is a scale of Congregationalists. And there are conservative Congregationalists, there are moderates, and there are people who become Unitarians. And they're the more liberal members of the faith.
So the conservatives are closer to the original Puritanism.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. So what sort of practices did Adams indulge in? Well, he said grace before meals. He engaged in family Bible readings. He had morning and evening devotions and was strict about keeping the Sabbath. So this is kind of at odds with, say, the whiskey drinking and card playing on the Sabbath, which Washington may or may not have indulged in. His language regarding religion was unquestionably orthodox, referring to Christ as our divine Redeemer. Post-Revolution, Adams attempted to revive a kind of Puritan covenant theology, meaning that, the people of Massachusetts had a divine covenant from God for their state and their existence here, and that the God of the Puritans had granted Massachusetts to them, and everyone needed to be worthy, and this was part of the price of maintaining a godly society. As an heir to the Puritan tradition, Adams believed that God rewarded or chastened a society according to the morality it exhibited, and despaired in his belief that morality was in a state of collapse. Now, I'm just going to say this. This is a common Adams belief that everything's just on the verge of collapse because change is always bad. So in this sense, this is kind of a typical mindset.
Sounds rather modern.
Well, yes.
Sounds like a lot of people in 21st century America are saying, actually, doesn't it?
Well, you do have pessimists with this, but I mean, the entire family, like Brooks Adams, is actually, he wrote a book about the degeneration of society due to democracy, the degenerative qualities of democracy, in the early 20th century.
The reason I mention that is it's curious to me because as you're saying this, right, I am seeing parallels to what a lot of particularly conservative Christians seem to be saying nowadays, or evangelical Christians.
Yes.
There's an idea that society is on the brink of collapse, around them because of all the immorality and whatever that they're upset about. But there's also an idea in evangelical Christianity, at least in some of it, that God founded the United States to carry out His. It was created as this special place, by God to carry out, I guess, His will or something. There is an idea of that there is a godly mission to the United States and its creation. And it sounds like Samuel Adams already was on that path way back then.
Well,
am I wrong to say that?
It wouldn't be the United States. It would be Massachusetts.
Well, okay, Massachusetts. But I'm saying the roots of it are coming from from that way of thinking.
Yes.
It may have come from elsewhere too, I don't know. But just saying, you can see it already there.
He had an idealized vision of his Puritan ancestors. And he was part of that, that family was part of that tradition. The Adamses include not only the people that are coming over with the Puritans, they're also coming over. They are descendants of John and Priscilla Mullins, who of the courtship of Miles Standish fame. They are very much imbued with the whole traditions of Massachusetts and the religious beliefs of the people who originally settled there.
And also the Pilgrim myth of they came over to have religious freedom that we talked about earlier.
Yes.
Very much that too.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
We're going to talk about this when we get to the person who actually wrote the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. This was actually authored by Adams's second cousin, John Adams. Article 3 summed up Adams's views, and it's not clear what his role was in the actual authorship of this, but he might have had an influence. But the quote is, "The citizens of Massachusetts had a duty to worship the Supreme Being, as religion preserved morality and was essential to society." We'll get into some of the rationale behind this when we get to John Adams, but I just figured it's worth noting that this was something that definitely summed up how he viewed things. Now, to discuss some of the beliefs that he exhibited towards other founding fathers, who we will also get into, the last public statement that Adams made regarding religion was addressed when he was 80 in 1702 to Thomas Paine. And when he learned that Paine had who he'd known since 1775.
1802.
1802, was going to publish his anti-religious classic, The Age of Reason. "When I heard that you had turned your mind to a defense of infidelity, I felt myself much astonished and much grieved at your attempted a measure so injurious to the feelings and so repugnant to the true interest of the United States of America. Do you think that your pen, or the pen of any other man, can unchristianize our citizens? Or have you hopes of converting a few of them to assist you in so bad a cause?" We'll get into this when we talk to Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine viewed deism as a superior religion to Christianity, and his denunciations of Christianity are probably what's setting off Adams in these remarks here. Within the context of New England and Congregationalism, Samuel Adams followed many of the conventional beliefs and was put out to see these beliefs challenged, considering them to be necessary for social harmony. So again, we're getting into the whole issue of social harmony and the importance of religion with regard to that, and the importance. Now, one distinction I think we should make here: Adams is not advocating with the national government, and he didn't really have that much to do with events outside of New England, as far as I could tell. He was mainly focused on Boston and Massachusetts. He was the mayor. There's a statue of him, and he's identified as a former mayor of Boston. If he was going to try and affect any sort of efforts to impose a sort of religious conformity, they are going to be limited to Massachusetts and Boston to enhance those sorts of traditions that he felt were important to the preservation of the state, not necessarily the national government. He did draw a line when you're basically preaching that Christianity is a bad religion, as we saw in his letter to Thomas Paine.
And now Marshall is going to move from Sam Adams to his cousin and more famous founding father, John Adams.
As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims, and as the said states never entered into any war or active hostility against any Mohammedan meaning Islam, nation, it is declared by parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. This is John Adams, Article 11, the Treaty of Tripoli, 1796. And I think it's important to note that all of the founding fathers are still alive at this point, and they could have raised any sorts of objections to this statement. So this was a treaty that was signed between the United States and Tripoli to protect U.S. merchantmen against pirates. It didn't quite work out that way because we ended up going to war with them under Jefferson. With the exception of the founding fathers, like I said, most were still alive, and all were free to object to this characterization. None did, nor did they wish to express a hatred of Muslims, even though none of them actually professed that. The religious preferences of John Adams are very individualistic, which is kind of consistent with his just life story. It is difficult for people to characterize him much like the man himself. It is important to bear in mind that both Christianity and Enlightenment thought, both of which Adams ascribed to in various degrees, are very broad categories, as we said before. Adams approached both in a way that he did most things in his own particular fashion, making him at the same time paradoxically the most orthodox and least orthodox Christian of the first four presidents of the United States.
Why is that?
Well, he did believe in Christianity. He considered himself as a Unitarian to be a Christian, but he's a Unitarian, and so he's totally opposed. He is making a public profession that he does not believe in the Trinity, which goes a lot further than a lot of the other founding fathers would be prepared to do. Even though privately
they might
be more. I mean, if we look at the source information we have on a lot of them, it's Franklin writing letters, it's Washington writing letters, it's Jefferson writing letters. They're not necessarily going out and proclaiming this stuff loudly. Adams is saying, I'm a Unitarian. That's my belief system. And we're going to get into what that kind of meant politically. To briefly review the career of John Adams, he is a lawyer by profession, and the law is very important to him in terms of his worldview and kind of how he approached the trajectory of the American Revolution. He famously defended the British officers who were engaged in the Boston Massacre and managed to get acquittals for them, even though he was opposed to heavy-handed British actions. He felt that everybody deserved a fair trial. He was highly influential in the passage of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson might have written it, but Adams got it through the various wickets that needed to get it approved by the various states. He also was involved in getting George Washington named. He thought it was a good idea to have a Virginian as the commander-in-chief of the American military. He and Franklin kind of cooked this up together between them. They collaborated very strongly before they had a falling out when they were both in France together. He was the author of the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution, which we'll get into as promised. He served as a diplomat to France, where he was remarkably ineffective and the United Kingdom, but also to the Netherlands, where he was very effective in getting loans from bankers in the Netherlands that helped support the American revolutionary effort. He was also our first vice president, a job he hated, and the second president of the United States, a job he performed admirably, but he's not considered in the top tier. He's actually considered to be in the top 20, but not in the top 10. This is mainly due to his own acerbic personality, his frankness, and Alexander Hamilton's machinations. Adams retained Washington's cabinet, and these were all Hamilton's creatures. He did appoint John Marshall to the Supreme Court in 1800 and spent his retirement reading Roman classics, mainly Cicero, who he admired immensely. And he kept up a lively correspondence with Jefferson after they mended their political differences. Both men died in 1826 on the 50th anniversary of July 4th. So, like his cousin, he is a product of New England's Puritan Pilgrim tradition. As such, he was imbued with the teachings of the Congregationalist belief system from an early age. He trained at one point to be a minister and married the daughter of a minister. So religion was very much a part of his life there. It was not a remote thing. And I mean, unlike, say, Washington and perhaps even Jefferson, he certainly had access to going to religious services, which he did twice, 3 times a day sometimes on Sundays. He gradually fell under the influence of the Enlightenment, and his beliefs evolved into Unitarianism, or the belief that there is only one God, there is no Trinity, or in the sense that the God created both Christ and the Holy Spirit, and these are subordinate entities. They're not co-equals with him. That is the important distinction to be made.
You know, it's funny to me that talking earlier here about how, for at least some of the founding fathers, they didn't have a big problem with mixing deism with Christianity.
Yeah.
Yet here we do have some kind of a boundary they're not willing to cross, where they're mixing deism, which says there's a creator who doesn't intervene and Christ isn't divine and all of that, right? They're willing to say that, but they're not willing to cross the line from Trinitarian Christianity into Unitarianism.
Yeah, I mean,
to me, it's just kind of odd that they've already accepted a belief system, at least in part, that almost rejects much of the idea of the divine in Christianity. Yet still, the Trinitarian aspect is so important to them that they make that distinction.
Yeah, I think that's funny. Deism would be more problematic
than Unitarianism.
But
it isn't, and I don't know why that is, but I'm just noting it's curious to me.
And you see, this I think is what we're discovering. This is a scale that people, since religion is very much a private thing, private matter, and they all ascribed to this. They all felt it was a private matter, not a civic matter, which was kind of what created all the problems in the 17th century, that they could come up with individual approaches to religion that may or may not conform to established customs. And they were free to do so, and there were to be no civil penalties, say, like what would happen in Britain.
Sure, but I'm just kind of, Blake put it best, it's like you'd think that being deist at all would automatically take you way beyond the issue of whether you're Trinitarian or Unitarian.
So it seems like a step beyond Unitarianism.
But somehow or another it doesn't. It's deism plus Christianity, but the Christianity must be Trinitarian. I just find that to be an odd juxtaposition.
Washington is going, there were other churches around. Washington was going to the Episcopalian Church,
He went to Quaker Church.
He went to Quaker Church,
too. He went to Catholic.
But to define oneself as an atheist would have been just completely out of bounds.
Yes, it is completely out of bounds for everybody.
Absolutely intolerable.
But Unitarian is very close to being out of bounds for a lot of people too, though.
Yes.
In a way that deism somehow isn't.
Right.
Well, you see, here's an interesting point. I'm going to bring up something that's current events. But recently, in the Department of Defense, which is its legal name, they decided to go after certain religions, certain chaplains, certain types of chaplains, certain belief structures that they're willing to recognize and treat as officially regarded religions, which I think is a kind of wrong from a constitutional perspective. And Unitarianism was actually read out. I mean, the two controversial things is they said, we're not going to recognize Unitarianism. There will be no clergy for Unitarianism in this particular order of things. And then there's also the fact that Mormons are thought to be no longer Christians.
Which they took offense to.
They took major offense to. Because they, and this is the thing. It's like Mike and I had a discussion with a friend of ours the other day who was insisting that Unitarians were not Christians. Absolutely adamantly insisting that this is the case. And this is not a crazy idea. A lot of people do believe that.
Yeah, I didn't mean to wander too far down this whole path, but I just found that aspect of it curious. I think we can just say that to many Christians, maybe the vast majority of them, the Trinitarian part of it is an extremely important component of Christianity, and if you're not willing to accept that, then it somehow makes you unchristian in their minds, and it appears to have been quite a, what's the right word, a stigma, even back in the founders' days, to go that far, even though deism wasn't necessarily going too far. As far as the Mormonism goes, that's because Mormonism comes later, but the argument that the other Christians, the mainline Christians, whatever term you want to use, would make is that they accept another book as a holy book beyond the Bible, and they also accept a later prophet than Jesus, and so both of those things disqualify them as Christians. That's the argument there.
Well,
they would say no, they're Latter-day Saints and such, right? That's where that debate
the
comes
Episcopalian Church does have the Book of Common Prayer, which is post-Bible. It's written during the Reformation, and they do have in the Episcopal Church, as anyone who's been to Episcopal services, they do have the Apostles' Creed, which is regularly read out at services, which does insist on the Trinitarian approach to religion in there. So something to keep in mind that anybody who's going to Episcopalian services of our Founding Fathers group, they're going to be reciting that when they go to church, just as a matter of course. Adams, in the meantime, is brought up with the culture of Calvinism, and though he rejected many theological tenets of it, he said that there were no better people than Calvinists, even though he didn't consider himself one. Adams embraced throughout his life the importance of good works as opposed to a focus on faith alone, and free will as opposed to predestination, both of which run counter to fundamental Calvinist beliefs.
So he thought the Calvinists were the best people, but
he
disagreed with them.
He disagreed with them. He didn't see a problem. I mean, there's kind of like, just think about this. He has a choice between rejecting his whole heritage to embrace the new, or he can kind of come up with sort of a cognitive dissonance approach of, Calvinists are good people.
They mean well. They're good people. Well. They're wrong.
I don't believe it.
That's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And I mean, again, this is about toleration. We're talking about people that are tolerant. Not all Founding Fathers were, as we've discussed, or could be, completely open about the extent of their belief system. Adams, as was typical of the man, was quite open in his religious preferences, which, as we said, were at odds with most Christians in America at the time. Although Unitarians' disbelief in the Trinity was at odds with prevailing Orthodox Christianity, Adams never faced any criticism for his beliefs in either of the national elections where he sought the presidency. Jefferson did. Jefferson was considered a dirty little atheist in some circles, even though he and Adams, their belief systems are not totally at odds with each other. So the second president of the United States is never critiqued at all for being a Unitarian. I looked and looked for this. I couldn't find anything that's indicated that he came into any sort of disrepute for this. Now later, when his son, John Quincy Adams, is running, his religious beliefs were seen as evidence of the alleged sin of elitism. This is an elite religion.
That was in what year?
That would have been 1824 and 1828. Depending on which year you're looking at. So Unitarianism suddenly becomes, post-Second Great Awakening, problematic.
More on that later.
Yeah, more on that later. He wasn't shy about his beliefs, penning the following to John Quincy Adams in 1816, describing his horror at Trinitarian theology. And an excerpt of this goes, an incarnate God, an eternal, self-existent, omnipresent, omnificent author of the stupendous universe suffering on a cross? My soul starts in horror at the idea, and it has stupefied the Christian world. Unitarianism had its roots in the 4th century. This is basically, there was a controversy. At one time, Unitarianism was the official belief system, that God was supreme and that Christ and the Holy Spirit were subordinate. But then the Council of Nicaea came in and changed all of that. Unitarianism made a comeback in the 18th century.
When was the Council of Nicaea?
325.
Okay.
And this is also included in the Book of Common Prayer that I mentioned earlier.
What is?
The Nicene Creed. The
Nicene
creed that
Creed
God and
the Trinity.
Yes, the Trinity.
Okay.
Adams was influenced by these Unitarian beliefs from the earlier time, but like his fellow founders, he was also influenced by the Enlightenment. Generally, this meant the teachings of Locke and Montesquieu and other English figures who took legalistic views of societal reform, emphasizing the importance of property. The Enlightenment was not an encompassing philosophy. Opinions ranged, as we've seen so far. For Adams, this meant a rejection of doctrines like original sin, predestination, the Trinity, and based of a rational and liberal religion, and respecting and following the moral teachings of Jesus Christ in an ethical and philosophical manner. Adams regarded Christianity as the most perfect of religions, even though there were and are some people in the United States who do not regard Unitarianism as part of Christianity. Many of his beliefs and practices were consistent with the followers of the more orthodox sects of Christianity. Like Franklin, Adams believed in a Christian God who could intervene in human affairs. This isn't at odds with the idea of like God being a clockmaker or a supreme architect who was sort of took a hands-off view of humanity. As president, Adams was not adverse to declaring national days of prayer and fasting. These proclamations tended to be generically monotheistic with calls on a higher power with no mention of Jesus. In contrast with some of his fellow founding fathers, Adams did not oppose the state's support of churches, and note that it's plural. Though he was opposed to establishment of a national religion at the federal level, Christian or otherwise, at the state level he felt accommodation with various religions within a state, meaning that they could receive tax money, and again, plural, whereas his cousin would have been more than happy to see this limited just to the Congregationalist Church. In the 1780 Constitution, state funds were directed towards the support of churches. All towns and parishes were required to levy taxes, to construct and repair churches, and to pay the salaries of ministers. People could designate which church would receive their own personal support, but you're not allowed to opt out of the whole process. You have to have some religion. Again, we're getting into the stigma that we would see associated with atheism.
Well, it also reflects the emphasis that we're seeing as a pattern here, I think, on the necessity of religion for morality.
Yes.
It doesn't matter that much which religion you ascribe to. Any religious practice is beneficial because it will give you a model of morality to practice. And then practicing that morality is important because that helps create tranquility in the society, in civil society, because people are treating each other well and all of that. So,
but they're not talking about Islam here.
No, they're...
Well, but
they're talking about their own traditions.
Yes.
Which are Christian.
Yes. But there's no Islamic person to basically designate funds to go to local mosque either.
True.
Fair enough. What I'm saying, though, is that I'm just seeing a pattern here, right? Sure, it's not too much worried about Muslims because are there very many?
No.
Running around in the United States at this time, right? It's
not many at all.
It's not really much of an issue for them. But among all the different Christian denominations, which caused a lot of wars in Europe in the 17th century, right? Among those various denominations, they're just saying, ascribe to one of them. That's a good thing. I don't care which one. And then in some cases, like Adams here, he's saying, and you should support those with money. You get to choose the one. State money. You get to choose the one, but they're important to civic society and therefore to civic tranquility.
Right.
Because they
serve a useful
They serve a useful purpose by creating a moral framework in which to live your life.
Now, Patrick Henry had the same view. Exactly.
We'll get to him.
And we're going to get to him.
We're going to get to him. But this was the law in Massachusetts until 1833, when this whole notion of state support to churches was revised. So compare Virginia, which is 1786, when something like this gets passed. So it persists in Massachusetts for a somewhat longer period.
Let's be clear, though. 1786 was Virginia doing away with having an established church.
Yes.
Now, the Massachusetts situation is they're doing away with taxation in support of a church.
Of any church.
Of any church, right.
Any church.
But they're doing away with that.
Yes.
So it's actually two a little bit different things.
Yes.
That's all I'm saying.
But it's still funding, it's still state funding of religion.
And it's still 47 years later.
Yes.
Is the difference, yeah.
Okay, so in this, and again, to get into the nitty-gritty of beliefs, talking about Washington playing cards and drinking whiskey, Adams tried to avoid transacting business or traveling on Sundays, and he also believed in an afterlife. He felt that when he died, he would be reunited with his wife Abigail. He believed that he enjoyed going to church. He went sometimes 2 or 3 times a day on Sundays, and he believed that religion in general civilized society, suppressing barbarism, and promoted moral behavior and making more competent citizens, in the sense that they would be observing moral teachings here. He did not approve, and this would be interesting when we think about what was going on in our China series, he did not approve of missionaries or the practice of sending Bibles overseas, notions that would put him at odds with a lot of people that would be of the sort of Second Great Awakening persuasion. He felt that the effort should be better spent on purifying Christianity than spreading further errors around the world. And by that, he's probably talking about Trinitarianism. In short, Adams hated organized religion's tendency to squelch rational thought, but approved of it as a force for instilling morality and social harmony.
Those are the religious views of 5 of the more prominent founding fathers. In the next episode, we'll cover the views of 5 more. That's it for this episode of the United States of Amnesia. Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something, and we hope you discovered new ways of looking at things you had already heard or thought about, or perhaps hadn't heard about. If you enjoyed it, that's great. If we made you mad, that's okay too. Either way, email us at usa.amnesia@gmail.com and let us know what you think. Also, let us know about anything you think we missed or got wrong. We'd like to know about that too. And of course, please like and subscribe and let your friends and neighbors know about us. We also have a website. It's www.usofamnesia.com. For Marshall, Mike, and myself, Blake Hinkey. Till next time.